Today I'm taking a look at Cloud Strife, one of the most highly regarded JRPG protagonists of all time, and the central hero of Final Fantasy VII. So, firstly, although it may sound superficial, we can't discount the quality of his visual design, particularly within the historical time and place that Final Fantasy VII was released. You know, the blonde spiky hair, the instantly iconic Buster Sword, the studded braces, and the solitary shoulder pauldron, all accenting this simple attire, was simply great character design from an aesthetic perspective. And combined with the intriguing juxtaposition between his very slim, lithe physique and this impossibly huge sword, you know, it was an instantly memorable concept. And while Tetsuya Nomura's art design is identifiably, you know, Japanese, his designs for Final Fantasy VII, they don't quite sit within the realms of a purist manga style. You know, it doesn't look like Dragon Ball Z, for example. And so Cloud straddles this fundamentally Japanese aesthetic with something plausibly figurative and potentially Western, which I think offered a real universal appeal to Cloud back in 1997 that not many JRPG games at the time, you know, were really managing to do. And they were still a very much kind of niche thing in the West and a distinctly Eastern Asian sort of thing. Beyond this, and returning to my earlier point about graphics, we should also remember that Final Fantasy VII was one of the first major JRPGs to be rendered in polygonal 3D for the new generation of PlayStation 1. And so the way Cloud's design is rendered in-game, particularly in the field screen, was also instantly iconic in its own way, because despite perhaps looking a bit goofy, you know, with this blocky, super deformed style, the fact that Cloud is reduced down to these simple geometric shapes also really accented the distinctive fundamentals of his design, you know, the blonde spiky hair, the soldier uniform, and so on, which really stands out and pops against these pre-rendered 2D backgrounds. You know, particularly in the early segment of the game, where we're looking at greeny greys of the Midgar landscape. You know, we've got this bright yellow hair and this vibrant purple kind of popping out against it. So Cloud was an instantly recognisable break from the norm, and, you know, we have to remember that most JRPGs at the time were still rendering their characters in 2D pixel form, pixel artwork such as Chrono Trigger, Xenogears, Final Fantasy Tactics, Breath of Fire, and so on. So from a visual perspective, I think Cloud was a very unique take on a JRPG hero in almost every way. Now, another important attribute of Cloud that was innovative for the time, but also endures to this day, is the numerous ways in which he subverts the hero archetype and the Campbellian concept of the hero's journey, which persists in many myths, fantasy stories, adventure games, and so on. And I'll unpack that in a moment. But just while I'm remembering, a final point on the appeal of Cloud is that arguably there is a certain timeless appeal that he has, owing to his central plight being more of a psychological, existential one, rather than the conventional adolescent coming-of-age tale or, you know, a straightforward good versus evil tale. And the reason I mention this is simply because I was talking to a friend recently about Final Fantasy, and I've been lifelong fans of the game and the series with this guy, and we were discussing Final Fantasy VIII, and he mentioned that he doesn't relate to Squall in quite the same way as he did when we were younger, because he felt that Squall had a very time-specific coming-of-age story that can be best related to if you're going through a similar age period or a similar transition as him, you know, i.e. adolescence and whatnot. But by comparison, he said that to this day, he really enjoys playing Final Fantasy VII, and he really enjoys playing through Cloud's story, you know, every time he turns to the game. Because he can relate to Cloud and emote with him, he feels that the story hasn't changed over the years, owing to the unique and complex themes of identity, psychological crisis that it deals with. And of course, that's one person's opinion, but I did like his suggestion that Cloud's story is timeless, and I think it's quite a good observation to make when considering the enduring appeal of his character, and by extension the enduring appeal of Final Fantasy VII, which, you know, has prompted all these spin-offs and sequels and prequels, culminating in the remake. So let's turn to Cloud's story, and as I mentioned, he subverts the common hero types that we often find in fantasy. There's no early introduction to our hero in their familiar territory, such as Squall in Garden, or Frodo in the Shire, or Tidus in Zanarkand, or Luke Skywalker on Tatooine, and so on. And indeed, quite to the contrary, our introduction to Cloud is a hero in motion. He's on board a train, thundering through this dense, impersonal cityscape in the midst of, chaos and action. There's no grounding or foundation to Cloud in this opening act. There's no establishment or introduction to his character's context or the adventure that he's embarking upon so far, which kind of hints, really, is almost foreshadowing that his central conflict is with his own past that comes later, because we find him in this state of flux. And we're very much introduced to this stoic, blank mercenary who's lacking in sentiment, and he's indifferent to everything, including the mission that he's been assigned to with Avalanche, in these opening moments of the game. The hero's journey is also subverted by the lack of a guide or mentor character to introduce our hero to their adventure. In the aforementioned examples, we have Quistis and Cid for Squall, we have Gandalf for Frodo, Orin for Tidus, and Obi-Wan Kenobi for Luke Skywalker. But Cloud is furnished with no such guidance, because he's presented to us as the finished article. He's already in possession of the unique hero's weapon, and is already relied upon by others, which are usually cornerstones of the fully realised hero, towards the end of a journey. Now, some might contest that Barrett Wallace fulfills the role of a mentor figure in the beginning of the game, but really, kind of reflecting on it, I feel that Barrett's initial role is more to do with giving context to the bombing missions and the macro planet in crisis story, rather than easing Cloud into an adventure and kind of guiding him. And indeed, Cloud and Barrett's relationship for the early part of the game is more combative than anything else. And the juxtaposition between them is great at establishing both the macro world-endangering story of Shinra destroying the planet and the individual smaller plight of Cloud's personality, which later converges with the wider story in a brilliant fashion. So these early indicators show Cloud's departure from convention, and I'd go further to suggest that where many Final Fantasy games also adopt fairy tale conventions, such as a Disney-esque romantic conclusion, our hero's adventure often aligns eventually to a female counterpart, Zidane and Garnet, Tidus and Yuna, Squall and Rinoa, to name but a few. But Cloud's story offers no such convenience, and the game in fact plays with these conventions by having Cloud caught in a love triangle between Tifa and Aeris, with an entire minigame and date sequence dedicated to this subplot, where, we take one or the other of them on a date. Or, much more comically, we can take Barrett or Yuffie on a night out in the Gold Saucer instead. So I'll touch more on the romance angle in a bit, but let's delve into Cloud's character. And as I stated way back in my Final Fantasy VII retrospective, Cloud's story hinges heavily on the theme of identity and this crisis of self following Mako poisoning and trauma. So, despite having this ready-made hero and hardened mercenary introduced to us at the beginning of the game, it's actually a bit of a red herring, and we soon learn that Cloud is an individual who isn't quite what he seems, and through no fault of his own, isn't who he says he is, or even who he thinks he is. And to this end, there's oddities and subtle hints that build up to this that we might have initially brushed off, such as a voice telling Cloud to watch out in the reactor right at the beginning, to Tifa being confused by some of the memories he has, and even President Shinra stating that he's never heard of Cloud before, despite this guy allegedly being Soldier First Class. And all these moments, and more, that's only a couple of examples, but they all contribute to this uneasiness that takes an unexpected turn when both Tifa and later a goading Sephiroth start poking holes in Cloud's backstory. So he proves a really interesting and unique hero in that for at least half of the game, he exists as a fabricated persona, a false hero, if you like, who's propped up by this muddled appropriation of Zack Fair's hopes and dreams. and he doesn't really become an authentic hero, or at least his authentic self, until well into the final third of the game, I'd say, once Tifa, eventually salvages his mind from yet another brush with Mako poisoning. Now, despite being an inauthentic personality, the Cloud we're introduced to at the beginning of the game isn't necessarily a blank personality or an arbitrarily crazy person either, but rather his identity and who he is, and how he came to be on this journey in the first place, can be triangulated, I think, by three key figures. And as I stated in my original review of the game, I think the first significant figure, and often overlooked figure, and influence on Cloud, is Tifa, who, in the childhood flashbacks, was a literal girl next door that Cloud was keen on, but he lacked the extroverted attributes to distinguish himself among the other children of Nibelheim, who often crowded around her. And so his decision to join Soldier is almost entirely based on his desire to prove himself and distinguish himself to Tifa, as we witness in the promise they make by the well, and he thinks that emulating the great Sephiroth, who was always celebrated as this apogee of strength and valour, at the time at least, was the way to go about this. The second character to inform Cloud's personality is, of course, Zack Fair, in a very literal sense, as everything Zack represents to Cloud, such as his confident personality, his status as Soldier First Class, working alongside Sephiroth, is what Cloud has sought out since childhood, and owing to Mako poisoning, he eventually appropriates from Zack and Zack's memories. And indeed, this not only informs him aesthetically, with the Buster Sword and the soldier uniform, but it also informs his role as a mercenary, which was Zack's aspirations, and also the misleading backstory which he delivers during the lengthy flashback sequence in the village of Calm. And, of course, this is a muddled account of both his and Zack's role in the events at Nibelheim. And just digressing, anyone interested in Zack and an intriguing, tragic story I think he has, I do have an episode dedicated to discussing him available on the channel, and I'll drop a link to that in the description, because he does overlap quite significantly with Cloud, I think, and there's a few other points that I cover in that. So, before moving on, I want to detour slightly at this juncture, because to this day there's a lot of conversation and questions and confusion as to A, how and why Cloud appropriates elements of Zack's memories and personality, and B, who exactly is the voice in Cloud's head warning him about reactors and other such stuff, because it's variously described as Sephiroth or Zack or even Cloud's mother, and possibly some manifestation of the livestream itself, and some of these characters emerging from the livestream. And I'm open to discussion on this too, because I'm of course only expressing my own opinions and understanding of the game here. So, for my part, with this sort of thing, I always look to evidence in-game as to why certain characters or story elements occur, because good storytelling generally dictates that audiences don't have to stray from the text to understand something. That being said, however, Final Fantasy games, being such dense narratives in expansive settings, make it quite easy to miss or overlook stuff, because often seemingly irrelevant NPCs and random locations are where we get exposition and subtle clarity on certain aspects of character and story. And, just off the top of my head, Professor Gast's diaries at the Icicle Inn and Zack's parents at Gongaga Village are very good examples of this in Final Fantasy VII. So, turning to Cloud's appropriation of Zack, some have argued that their minds merged owing to Hojo's experimentation and exposure to Genova cells and so on, which would account for Cloud's knowledge of Zack's life and the assimilation of his memories, which is possible, although on the Genova cells point I think it's generally regarded that Zack's body rejected Genova, which is why he never kind of played host to the weirdness that Cloud undergoes. But for my part, and looking to evidence in-game, I always put it more down to Zack's conversation, or rather his monologuing at the comatose Cloud in the back of the truck to Midgar. And the reason we return to this scene so often, and the reason it's significant, is to illustrate this information transfer between the two, and Zack explaining everything about his life, his hopes to become a mercenary alongside Cloud in Midgar. It directly correlates to the Cloud that we see appearing at the beginning of the game, who is a mercenary, owing to this information and these aspirations that he's taken from Zack. And I think if Zack's mind and memories were literally assimilated into Cloud's mind, as is so often argued, you'd assume that encountering his parents at Gongaga, or encountering Aeris, who is his ex-girlfriend, would trigger some potent and emotional response, rather than a reactor and a desire to be a mercenary, which are actually quite tame compared to, these kind of relationships that you might have fostered in life. And on the note of the voice in Cloud's head at the reactor and other intervals throughout the game, I've suggested in the past that this is actually the real Cloud, who is stuck inside the muddled Cloud's mind, and this entity seems to materialise at particularly important fight or flight moments, such as the reactor in the beginning of the game before the boss fight, or when Cloud interacts with Sephiroth at the Temple of the Ancients. We have this kind of inner child literally manifest, along with the subconscious text attempting to stop him. And finally, Tifa once again converses with this version of Cloud during the subconscious episode. So I always figured that this was a manifestation of Cloud's true self in his mind. And there are other small moments when Cloud's at Nibelheim, for example, and he has sort of internal monologue memories, or when he's thinking back to Nibelheim, when he's staying at Aeris' mother's house. So that's my contention to that end, and as I've said, I'm happy for open discussion on that. And having said that, of course, there are intervals where we do seem to see Sephiroth and also Jenova, after defeating Jenova Life, communicating with Cloud in what seems to be perhaps a psychic way, because we do have the open text that isn't bound in the box, so I'm assuming it's kind of thoughts. And interestingly, some of the guys over at the livestream.net, which I think is generally a pretty good source of lore and translations, they've previously suggested that the "watch out, this is more than just a reactor" line is actually adapted from a scrapped conversation with Sephiroth at Nibelheim. And they provide the translation link in there, which goes to the Ultimania Omega, which was in Japanese. So if that's the case, it's interesting to know whether that was supposed to be a Sephiroth line, or whether it was simply adapted for Cloud, or possibly Zack, for that opening part of the game. And again, I suppose it remains open to discussion, and I expect perhaps that the Final Fantasy VII Remake will adapt or explain this a bit more, if they retain it at all. Now, moving on to the final influence on Cloud, we have, of course, Sephiroth. And this guy is a brilliantly written character who looms over and profoundly influences events, despite not really being present much in the contemporary events of the game. And as far as Cloud goes, Sephiroth serves as his foil in two key ways. Firstly, the original heroic Sephiroth was this widely revered elite soldier, Ubermensch character that the young Cloud idolised and aspired to emulate. He saw Sephiroth as an avatar of physical and mental aptitude, and thought that achieving this level of status and reputation would make Tifa, along with everyone else, notice him. After Sephiroth goes bad, he goes from Cloud's greatest hero to Cloud's greatest nemesis, and fueled by a sense of betrayal and revenge, since Sephiroth destroyed Cloud's hometown of Nibelheim. This sets in motion the confused feelings of awe and trepidation with which Cloud regards Sephiroth throughout the events of Final Fantasy VII, most noticeably in the Shinra Tower, after he notices the Masamune sword impaling President Shinra. It's also an interesting twist that, owing to Cloud's experimentation by Hojo during the Nibelheim incident, and the fact that his body is hosting Jenova cells, which has been misleadingly translated as cloning in the game, which I think threw a lot of people, because we have a certain idea of cloning, he's actually being physically and mentally drawn to Sephiroth in the game, rather than actively pursuing him, as he initially thinks. So it's interesting how there's this kind of inextricable bond between them. Now, this draws me on to my final significant point about the relationship between Sephiroth and Cloud, which is this concept of the shadow self, to use the Jungian phrase, which is often employed as a character type that shares very similar attributes to a hero, and yet is diametrically opposed to them in several key ways, usually along the lines of good versus evil, or moral versus immoral. And we have comparable examples such as Squall and Cypher, Zidane and Kuja, Noctis and Ardyn, and so on. But Cloud and Sephiroth are interesting because while in many ways they play to this archetypal duality between good and evil, owing to the uniqueness of Cloud's story, they also subvert the convenience of this concept and depart from it in several ways too. For example, much like other examples of the shadow self, there are conceptual consistencies between the characters. Squall and Cypher are both orphans and gunblade specialists. Kuja and Zidane are both Terran clones, and Cloud and Sephiroth have both gone along believing themselves to be one thing, with Sephiroth thinking he's an ancient, and Cloud thinking he's soldier first class, only to discover that they are something else entirely, and products of experimentation, which prompts an acute personal crisis and an existential meltdown. And even prior to this, they both prove to be slightly odd and outcasted characters that don't really fit in with everyone else, as we see in the flashbacks. Additionally, much like other hero-villain connections, such as Noctis and Ardyn being ancestors, or Tidus and Jecht being relatives, Cloud and Sephiroth's connection also runs along genetic lines, owing to this experimentation, and both of them hosting Genova cells, and thus they are inextricably linked by the reunion theory, and later Sephiroth's powerful influence over Cloud. So this builds a case for the duality archetype. However, it's also undermined in several ways, because where the aforementioned heroes and villains are all on a par with one another, in terms of aptitudes, and where there's a certain fatedness between them in their respective stories, Cloud and Sephiroth are, on paper at least, completely polarised in terms of their strength, but also quite misaligned in terms of narrative trajectory as well. And as I stated in my Zack Fair episode, it's almost as if Zack was this fated hero who never was, because he was the one that had the history with Sephiroth. He was the one that was on equal footing with him as a soldier first class. And he was the one who had this blossoming romance with Aeris back home. But rather than fulfilling the conventions of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey by overcoming his adversary for a Disney-esque happy ever after, he gets murdered and inadvertently usurped by this unexpected and unknown quantity, which is Cloud. Indeed, looking at the flashback sequences at Nibelheim, Cloud is revealed to be this run-of-the-mill foot soldier, undistinguished, uninteresting, and Sephiroth is barely aware of his existence, let alone experiencing any sort of fated connection with him. And this is what makes Cloud so interesting and such a departure from the conventions of fantasy storytelling, I think. Because his connection to Sephiroth is actually pretty tenuous, at least in the beginning. And as we see in the contemporary events of the game, Sephiroth goads him and mocks him and utilises him, but as a puppet rather than as an equal and an adversary. And it's really only his attempts to obtain the black materia that Sephiroth has any real interest in Cloud. So, as I've stated in the past, it's interesting that Cloud's shortcomings and Sephiroth's strengths are their definitive traits early on, and where Sephiroth is this revered soldier, as I mentioned, and Zack is this strong, honour-bound, affable guy, Cloud is this kid who couldn't distinguish himself in the crowd and couldn't make it in soldier, and seems to be far from this fated, chosen one sort of angle that is employed in many stories. And where some even compare Cloud to Squall, because they're both this awkward, stoic, introverted guy, that undergoes a transformation, we have to remember that even Squall, despite his insecurities, was always considered a chosen one by Adia and Sid, owing to the time compression time loop storyline and how they've sort of groomed him for leadership from childhood. So Cloud's journey, by comparison, is very interesting and much more about him overcoming himself and rediscovering himself and persevering that makes him such an awesome and enduring, relatable character, I think. There's something very human about that. Now, I'm going to wrap up on this Sephiroth segment, but I finally just want to draw attention to an aspect of story that, although was absolutely necessary to set up a personal friction between hero and villain, it does slightly jar for some, and this is the fact that Cloud defeats Sephiroth way back in Nibelheim, in the reactor, and subsequent Final Fantasy material has made this seem even more bizarre when, for example, we see Sephiroth beating up two elite soldiers, Angel and Genesis, in Crisis Core, like as if they're nothing. But extended material aside, I think it's an interesting plot device that to this day has people debating it, and is probably worth touching on here. So, one thing I've read in recent years, but haven't actually checked out myself, is that in the Nibelheim flashback, Cloud has preemptive strike materia equipped, if you check his slots in the menu screen, just before we confront Sephiroth. And this accounts for how he managed to sneak up on Sephiroth and, stab him and get the jump on him. And if this is true, and the developers actually included this, I think it's a pretty freaking subtle and amusing piece of in-game lore that I imagine some, such as myself, may have missed out on to this day, despite numerous playthroughs. But also on this showdown scenario, we have the finale when Cloud lifts Sephiroth by his own Masamune sword and throws him into the life stream. And again, as I say, I think this is a necessary story device that allows our primary hero and our primary villain to finally encounter one another and have this sort of personal tension for future events. But owing to the aforementioned distinctions of Cloud failing to succeed in Soldier and Sephiroth being this ultimate soldier, I can understand why this jars with some people, and I can't help but think that the scenario writer was staring at a piece of paper for a long time, thinking, how do I reconcile these two characters? To throw a further curveball and observation into the works, and looking at the extended material where we revisit this scene, it seems that the writers did try and reconcile it with a couple of retcons. For example, in the Last Order anime, we see Cloud mildly injuring Sephiroth, but then Sephiroth jumping into the live stream of his own accord, which is quite an interesting approach to it. And other instances, such as Crisis Core, show their own version of events, where we have kind of Zack more heavily involved, and stuff like that. So, it's a bit of a sticky situation that I'm interested to see how they potentially retcon yet again in the remake. But I suppose that remains to be seen. And in any case, I think the general consensus of this scenario is that Cloud managed to muster this hitherto unknown potential in himself because it was such an emotionally intense moment. He was outraged about Zack and Tifa being hurt, and of course about his hometown being destroyed. That allowed him to best Sephiroth. And perhaps I'm just being pedantic by questioning it, but, that's the accepted narrative, and it will be interesting to see if that changes once again. Moving on, and I'm conscious of time and I will wrap up soon, but I think there is a lot of interesting stuff to say about Cloud's story. I think the glaring absence in the conversation so far is Aeris, and while many hold her in high regard and consider her to be Cloud's true romance, owing to us seeing their relationship develop over the game, and this emotive response he has to her death, and of course that iconic cutscene of them doing the water burial, I think that rather than the whole Tifa Aeris debate, which tends to be the common discussion around, Cloud and Aeris, I think she's also really interesting to think about regarding Cloud and how he's imposed on Zack, and where he's adopting all these facets of Zack Fair and this legacy of Zack, such as the Buster Sword, the mercenary lifestyle, and so on. It's almost as if he's inadvertently imposed upon Zack's destined romance as well. And looking at how Cloud is torn between these two romances, the first being his childhood sweetheart Tifa, and the other being Zack's former sweetheart Aeris. It's interesting symbolism and emblematic of how he's muddled his own life with Zack's. So Aeris was a very clever element to help emphasise this point, a very subtle nod to the player, at least in the original game. And whether they make a more literal reference to Zack in the remake, I'm not sure, but owing to Zack's subsequent exposition, in Crisis Core specifically, it does seem quite likely and logical for them to do so. I also think, just as a end note on Aeris, I think her death was also quite an important scene regarding Cloud, because having played back through that part of the game recently, Cloud's reaction when he states, my fingers are tingling, my throat is dry, what am I feeling, to paraphrase him, it's quite interesting because this is the first time since his Mako poisoning, prior to the game events, that he actually seems to be conveying a raw, potent emotion, and it's almost like he's briefly broken through this stoic facade and this muddled, fabricated persona. And as we see, Sephiroth and Genova are very quick to point out at this point that he can't have any feelings because he's a puppet. So, yeah, quite an interesting game moment there as well. So, finally, the last time I discussed Cloud, I did catch some heat for using words like weak and failure and shortcomings because, of course, he is presented to us as this badass mercenary with, a massive sword. And that's what many fans love about him. And I'd just like to conclude and wrap up by discussing the final act of his story arc, which is when he does finally fulfill this hero status and overcome these weaknesses and attain this personal strength that he musters and succeeds through the game with. And in many ways, it's much more meaningfully earned than other fantasy heroes and Final Fantasy heroes, I think, because of where Cloud comes from, what he suffered and the fact he has been a failure in the past. He was never a star blitzball player, he was never an expert thief, or an elite Dark Knight, or a Lucian prince, or a mercenary student groomed for leadership. He was a human, he was average. He didn't have any superpowers or super credentials. But he gets a second chance, and this is why once Tifa salvages him from the live stream, and we're all reunited on the Highwind with that uplifting music playing, he's so much more a rewarding hero, because it illustrates a very human perseverance about him that I've always really enjoyed. I'd also like to note that beyond this powerful redemption tale, it's not all sincere and serious existential drama, but the wider scope of Cloud that I haven't really touched on is this penchant for humour and the certain goofiness that he permits that other protagonists often don't. He cross-dresses, he tells a guy he's going to cut his nuts off, he tells a Shinra dog that he's going to dog-nap it, and comes out with lines like, let's mosey. And to paraphrase Sid Highwind, he says something along the lines of, just when you think he's cool, he goes and shows how damn stupid he is. And that's the full spectrum of Cloud. He's such a brilliantly realised and well-rounded character in the original Final Fantasy, which I really hope is retained in the remake, because it's notable that Advent Children and other subsequent material tends to strip away the comical elements of Cloud in favour of the more brooding, melancholic storyline. So that about wraps up my thoughts on Cloud today. I think there's certainly more that can be discussed on him, and I always leave these things off feeling like there's more to say. So perhaps a part 2 or a post-remake discussion will be worth exploring in the future. But suffice to say, he's a great character and a great Final Fantasy hero whose two brushes with Mako poisoning, the one that damages him and the one that Tifa restores him from, serve as excellent catalysts to the chaotic personal journey that he undergoes during the events of Final Fantasy VII. So, if you got this far, thanks very much for listening. Kudos to you. And feel free to drop a comment below. Let me know your thoughts on Cloud and the discussion. And if you enjoyed the episode, of course, please consider sharing on your social channels and also subscribing to keep updated with my latest posts.